Hello, everyone. Today we're covering the man who embodies the rise of the new right, the man who redefined and reshaped the new Republican Party. Today we're covering the presidency of Ronald Reagan. All right, so let's get started. So Reagan doesn't have a very big political career. He was a pretty popular actor, and he was also more involved in the political aspects of it. He was the president of the Screen Actor Guild, and this combined with him being a pretty popular actor eventually led him to be the governor of California. After becoming the governor of California in 1980, the country was undergoing a lot of transformations. There was like a big power vacuum because if you think about it, there was a lot of political, social, and economic instability because neither the Republican Party through Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal or Jimmy Carter's presidency, this new Democratic Party couldn't really connect with the people. And I think what is very telling is that, for example, Jimmy Carter had a 28% approval rate, right? So this is even lower than Richard Nixon after Watergate. Okay, so this tells you that people didn't have a lot of trust in Carter or the Democratic Party. And I don't want to talk too bad about Jimmy Carter. He recently passed away, but his presidency was pretty much a failure, and it very much opened up the doors for Ronald Reagan to be the best president because during those circumstances, Reagan represented a return to stability, politically, economically, socially. And so to illustrate just how popular Ronald Reagan was, let me show you the presidential election map of 1980. And as you can see, Ronald Reagan won in one of the biggest landslides in American history. Okay, so I think this proves two things. One of them is the failed presidency of Jimmy Carter, but also how much the American people were looking for a new type of leadership that they found with Ronald Reagan. All right, so this is in a way embodies how much people were wanting to move forward. And this idea, this new coalition of the new right, shows here in the presidential map in 1980. And so, just like we have a rise of a new left, we're also going to see a rise of a new right. And this new right is actually mostly an opposition to the new left. All right. So, we're going to see, for example, economic conservatives, right? So, these people believe that we're paying too much taxes, right? They believe that the Great Society has put an unnecessary burden due to all the social programs. And, they don't want to be paying as much taxes. I believe the statistic is that around this time in 1980, about 60% of Americans believe that we were paying too many taxes, right? So, economic conservatives, people who are not necessarily anti-war, but rather these are people who are want to be tougher on communism. So people who support the fight for against communism, economic conservatives, but also religious people, right? A lot of religious people, are gonna kind of sort of find a new home on the right because they're a little bit concerned with this new idea of abortion, sexual revolution, the removal of prayer in schools. So they feel a little bit forgotten by the Democratic Party because this party actually supports these ideas, and they're gonna find a new home in this new right. And finally, we're also gonna see people who are very traditional, people who support family values, people who feel like this you know, counterculture movement and all different things that align with this new Democratic Party that, is very much against their principles, right? This family values, this, traditional way of living, and they're gonna find a new home in this new right that is going to be highlighted and represented mainly by Ronald Reagan. So the presidency of Ronald Reagan is gonna come in the form of the Reagan Revolution, right? So for our purposes, we're going to cover four major themes of the Reagan Revolution, right? So it's going to be the Reaganomics, so basically the economic policies of Ronald Reagan, the Cold War policies. We're also going to talk about shrinking the government, and we're also going to talk about moral clarity, right? So it's basically the idea of returning to family values and all different things. Okay, so as far as Reaganomics. Reaganomics is just basically supply side economics or trickle down economics, which basically means that in order to stimulate the economy, you need to give tax cuts to businesses. So businesses can in turn invest more in the United States, and in investing more is creating more job opportunities. So the idea of trickling down is that it starts in the top and then it trickles down to the bottom, right? Now, the Reaganomics has a second part to it, and it's basically a 25% tax cut across the board. Everyone loves tax break, right? So in this case, it comes with a trade-off, all right? So it's basically saying, I'm cutting your taxes, good news. Bad news, in order for us to cut the taxes, we need to get rid of some social programs, right? And in this case, the social programs is going to be some of the things that were brought by the Great Society, right? I believe it's going to be food stamps, it's going to be public housing, and it's also going to be Medicaid. Okay, so these are the programs that are going to see, they're not going to be completely eliminated, but their funding is going to get drastically reduced. Okay, so we do get tax breaks across the board, paying 25% less as taxes. At the same time, we are getting less social welfare, right? So this is the controversial tax brackets before and after Reagan. And as you can see, the tax bracket switched from 14% all the way to 70%, from a flat 15 and to a 28%. And again, the idea behind it is to reduce the tax burden on the Americans, right? So eliminating social programs and basically let Americans keep most of their money rather than spending for social programs. Okay, so the main criticism towards this is that if you notice, of course, the top earners are the ones who are enjoying most of the breaks, right? So from 70 to 28, so that means that you are keeping a whole lot more of your money. Okay, so whether you consider this to be good or bad is really up to your interpretation. A lot of people see it bad because the top earners are enjoying most of the tax breaks, whereas the bottom earners are not really enjoying that much of that tax bracket. And so another justification for this tax bracket is to incentivize Americans to work more so you can earn more and keep more. Right? So again, it really depends on how you see it. I know today we have a popular idea of the redistribution of wealth in America, so this is highly unpopular and there's a lot of people who are very critical of it, but you also see a lot of people who see this as, a great incentive for people to leave welfare, go to work, and enjoy most of your earnings. In this case, the ideal Reagan thinks he's killing two birds with one stone, and this is that people have become too dependent on the government, and in doing so, in cutting social welfare, people will become less reliant on the government, and at the same time, he's cutting taxes, and at the same time, he's doing this idea of trickle down economics, which is supposed to stimulate the economy, and people are gonna get more jobs, right? So this is going to have mixed results. And as you can imagine, it's going to be very controversial. I'll talk about the outcomes of this idea at the end, right? But I want to move on to the idea of the Cold War policies. Now, this Cold War policy, definitely is very effective because, we're going to vanquish the Soviet Union. At the same time, you need to consider that is at what cost, right? Because once again, we go back to we're taking away social welfare from this group of people and we're saving this money, but we're using it and adding a little bit more spending so we can have a military arms buildup and force the Soviet Union into a collapse, right? So, you know, it did work. The question is kind of sort of like, was it worth it, right? Number three is the idea of shrinking the government. So the idea of this is that the very famous phrase of Reagan, government is not the solution, government is the problem. Okay, so one of the tenets of Ronald Reagan is that the government spent too much money on social welfare, but also on things that he considered unnecessary and that were a burden to the taxpayer. So let me show you a video where he explains, some of this government spending, and he starts to delineate how much we need to start eliminating a lot of these costs, right? So,
and we've asked so much of government, and we've gotten in the habit over the last 40 years of thinking that government has the answers. There's very little that government can do as efficiently and as economically as the people can do themselves. And if government would shut the doors and sneak away for about 3 weeks, we'd never miss them. The if the people
Anybody you had in mind particularly?
no, I said this while I was in government.
Okay.
Our biggest problem is that we have built a permanent structure of government, federal, state, and local, the permanent employees, and they come to the place that they actually determine policy in this country more than does the Congress of the United States. There are 14.5 million public employees in the United States. That's quite a voting bloc. And the bureaus and agencies, not in Washington, I heard you talking earlier about some of the research programs. Well, there was a senator the other day, and he took up some pages of the congressional record. He was doing the same thing you were, listing all these crazy research programs and how much they were costing, and wound up his speech by introducing his own. He wants a study and a research of transcendental meditation. So, there's a state senator in Michigan, and he just found out the other day they got a $93,000 study on whether chitlins are bad for you. And and he said that as a fourth generation chitlin eater, he figured that he could tell you how for 93 cents you could find out the answer to that.
No, we laugh at those things, but they do happen, I guess.
Oh, listen, you have some beauties and there's some others. What would you say if I told you about a study in which this was called the demography of happiness? And in this study, the government found out that young people are happier than old people. And they found out that people that earn more are happier than people that earn less. And they found out that well people are happier than sick people.
That's good. Well, that's
This was $249,000 to find out it's better to be rich, young, and healthy than old, poor, and sick.
Right, so if this sounds a little bit familiar, this is very similar to what the Department of Government Efficiency, led by Elon Musk today, is trying to do, right? Eliminate waste, fraud, corruption. So this is something that goes back to, in a lot of ways, this idea of Reagan, right? Eliminating government waste, reduce the size of the government, reduce the spending of the government. And this is part of one of his core tenets in the idea of small government. And finally, the idea of going back to traditional values, right? Moral clarity. Okay, so uh, the idea is all this counterculture movement, all this sexual revolution, all this, things of the 70s are things of the 70s, right? And by the way, this idea that we have today of make America great again, this is a motto of Ronald Reagan. Let's make America great again. So, what Reagan meant by making America great again is basically this, right? Returning to family values, returning to becoming a more religious nation, to becoming a place of business where people can make a lot of money, to, cutting social welfare because he wants to stimulate people to be more self-reliant, to not be dependent on the government. You know, these are the things that Reagan considers, the idea of making America great again. And these are the tenets of the Reagan Revolution, which, as you can imagine, are very controversial, right? And have mixed results that we're going to talk about next. So, did Reagan policies work, right? Kind of, sort of, but not really, like I mentioned earlier. Okay, so uh, the way I like to explain this is that the US as a nation did improve economically, right? So the economy of the US really was stimulated by these policies. It really did work, this idea of the Reaganomics. However, individually, person by person, not really, at least not everyone. Okay, because if you think about it, when you cut the social welfare, the people who are going to be the most affected are the lower economic classes, right? These people who are not going to have access to, food stamps, people who are not going to have access to Medicaid, public housing, and on top of that, the people who are at the top, they are enjoying most of these benefits, right? The 25% tax cut, plus if you're in a business, deregulations, tax cuts for the businesses. So the people in the higher classes enjoyed it the most. The people in the lower classes didn't see as much benefit. Uh, but as a nation, we did improve economically, right? So in a way, this Reaganomics, one of the outcomes is going to be that, the income inequality is going to be expanded, meaning a lot of people the rich get richer and some of the poor people get poorer, right? So this is one of the unfortunate outcomes of the Reaganomics, but some of the people that really like Reagan like to argue that at the same time that this is happening, this is trying to stimulate people from stop being reliant on the government, right? This is trying to bring more individual responsibility for these people who were too reliant on the government, right? So you can always have two sides to the argument. And yes, the income inequality grew. At the same time, the defenders of Reagan like to argue that where is the individual responsibility of all these people? Okay, so it's really a matter of opinion. A lot of people love Reagan and a lot of people hate Reagan. And so if you're wondering how popular was Ronald Reagan through all this Reagan Revolution, this is the presidential election map of 1984. This is the biggest presidential landslide in American history. Right? Reagan earned 525 of the electoral votes, which is the most in American history, and I believe he also won the popular vote by about 13 million votes. Right? So this just gives you a little bit of an insight of how much people supported this idea of the Reagan Revolution. And if you think about it, Ronald Reagan is kind of sort of the opposite of LBJ, right? So you could argue that LBJ's Great Society is trying to help out the poor at the expense of the rich because they're the ones who bear the tax burden, the economic burden to help the poor. And Ronald Reagan is trying to make it into a very like individual responsibility, right? I can't have the rich pay for the poor. It's an individual responsibility, and maybe you become too reliant on the government, and it's time for you to snap out of it, right? So these are really two different ways of thinking about the economic situation during the Reagan Revolution. But the reality is that a lot of people hate Reagan. A lot of people love Reagan, right? So he's one of those presidents, very much like LBJ, that is gonna be very divisive for a lot of people. And so, as far as the legacy of Reagan, is really going to depend on where you stand politically, right? Because if you're a conservative or you're leaning more to the right, you're probably going to love the idea of a charismatic, quick-witted, someone who stands for family values, for religion, someone who loves America, someone who is for, small government, not a lot of government dependency, but a lot of self-reliance. So if you are on that side of the aisle, you're probably going to love the idea of Reagan. And like I mentioned, I'm not covering everything about the Reagan presidency, but this main points kind of sort of highlight why so many people on the right love Reagan or love the idea of Reagan, right? And if you're stand on the left, if you're more of a liberal, you're probably not gonna like the idea of Reagan, right? Someone who cut social welfare, someone who's Reaganomics, this economic policies, the outcome is gonna end up being the rich becoming rich, the poor becoming poorer, and you're probably not gonna like this idea of a very structured, putting in the front seat family values, putting in the front seat the idea of religion. And, this is why he's such a controversial figure, right? Because the country is very divided into right wing, left wing, and it really depends on who you ask. The legacy of Ronald Reagan is always going to be divided, is going to be controversial, but it is ripe with very interesting conversations about the role of government, about redistribution of wealth, about the idea of social welfare. So Reagan sparks a lot of very interesting conversations, and I always find them a very interesting character. And again, this is all I have for you today. Let me know what you think, and I'll be around again. Okay, see y'all.